Not just through one headline, not just through one difficult season. Through years of noise, years of rumors, years of the kind of chaos that follows certain names the way shadows follow light. She had built something around herself, carefully, deliberately, brick by brick, and almost nothing had been able to get through it. Not the cameras, not the commentators. Not the endless cycle of speculation that feeds on people like her. But then came the arrest, and something cracked open. Because when the news broke, when Tiger Woods' name lit up phones and screens across the country in the quiet hours of that May morning, it didn't feel like just another celebrity story to everyone. Who saw it? For some people, it felt close, it felt personal, and the people around Vanessa Trump began to notice something shifting in her, something behind the composure. Something she had kept so carefully locked away for so long that even the people closest to her weren't sure she still had access to it. And then she spoke. When she did, people stopped. They leaned in, they listened in a way that people rarely listen anymore, not for the scandal, not for the drama, but because something in her words felt unexpectedly real. She wasn't angry. She wasn't political, she wasn't performing. What she said was something quieter than that and somehow far more powerful because of it. Something that didn't fit the story the world had already decided to tell about both of them. There's a version of this moment that the tabloids covered. Fast, loud, stripped clean of anything resembling nuance. This is not that version. This is about what it actually means when a person who has guarded their silence for years, who has chosen quiet over and over again in a world that screams for attention, finally decides that silence isn't enough. It's about what that moment reveals. About empathy, about pain, about the strange invisible threads that sometimes connect people who the world would never think to place in the same sentence. And it begins the way most true things do, long before anyone was paying attention. To understand why her words landed the way they did, you have to go back further than the headlines. Further than the court documents, further than the celebrity gossip, further than the version of events that was assembled in real time by people watching from a distance. You have to go back to the quieter life that existed before all of it. The life that most people never saw because Vanessa Trump made sure of it. She had never been easy to define. She was not someone who moved toward attention naturally. She married into one of the most publicly scrutinized families in American history, built a life inside that storm, raised 5 children largely away from the lens. And when her marriage to Donald Trump Jr. came to an end in 2018, she did something that genuinely surprised people who understood the world she was living in. She went quiet. She didn't trade stories for sympathy. She didn't sit down in front of cameras with carefully rehearsed pain on her face. She moved through the end of her marriage the way someone moves through a house after a fire, slowly, deliberately, focused entirely on salvaging what mattered and walking away from what didn't. Her composure wasn't cold. People who were close to her knew that it was chosen. It was constructed with a kind of care that only comes from understanding exactly what gets destroyed when you let the public inside. And quietly, people noticed. Over time, her silence became something in itself, not absence, not avoidance. It became a statement. It said something about who she was more clearly than any interview could have. And it made the moment she eventually chose to speak feel, to those paying attention, like something worth stopping for. Tiger Woods exists in a completely different kind of space. There are few people in the history of sport who have carried as much brilliance, as much pressure, as much public mythology, and eventually as much visible pain. He didn't just play golf. He rewrote what people believed was possible on a course. He became something closer to a symbol than a human being to millions of people who watched him. And that elevation, as it almost always does, came with a cost that took years to fully surface. His 2017 arrest in Jupiter, Florida was one of those moments that arrives without warning and changes everything. According to reports from that morning, he was found asleep at the wheel in the early hours of Memorial Day. Law enforcement noted visible signs of impairment. Woods released a statement shortly after, explaining that an unexpected interaction between prescribed medications had caused the episode. Toxicology reports confirmed no alcohol was present in his system. He accepted the legal process without resistance, entered a diversion program, and addressed the situation publicly and with visible accountability. The news cycle swallowed the story quickly, the way it always does. But for certain people, people who had lived close to that particular kind of pressure, who had watched public life do what it does to human beings when it decides they are no longer worth protecting, the story didn't move on quite as fast. And that is where Vanessa enters this picture. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and in a way that mattered. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that accumulates in a person who lives publicly without ever having chosen it. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in gradually, like dust on a surface, invisible until the light hits it a certain way, and then suddenly impossible to ignore. Vanessa Trump knew that exhaustion intimately. She had spent years moving through a world where her name alone was enough to generate attention, not because of anything she had built or done, but because of who she was connected to. A marriage. A family, a name that meant something enormous to people who had never met her and would never understand the distance between the public version and the private one. She built structure around herself, routines, a quiet life, a circle small enough to trust. She kept her children as far from the noise as she could manage, and she trained herself to move carefully in any space where cameras might be present. People who knew her described a woman who was genuinely warm in private, someone who laughed freely and felt things deeply, but who became measured, almost guarded. The moment she sensed the world was watching. That guardedness was not coldness, it was self-preservation, because she understood, perhaps better than most, that a single unguarded sentence could become a headline before the day was over. That the machinery of public opinion was not interested in accuracy so much as it was interested in volume. And she had watched that machinery operate on people she cared about. She had seen what it left behind. So when the Tiger Woods story broke, and when questions began to surface about how people in adjacent public circles were responding, the fact that she said anything at all was unusual enough to catch attention. The question that followed was a simple one, but it didn't have a simple answer. Why now? After all the silence, after all the careful restraint, why this and why him? The morning of May 29, 2017 began like most mornings do. Ordinary, unremarkable. People were waking up slowly into a long holiday weekend, thinking about nothing more complicated than sun and food and rest. And then the alerts started arriving. Tiger Woods, arrested. Suspected DUI, Jupiter, Florida. Within a matter of hours, it was everywhere. On every screen, in every conversation, on every platform that existed to distribute the most dramatic available information as fast as possible. And the response was immediate, and it was divided in the way these things always are, some people leaning toward sympathy. Especially as the details about prescription medication interactions became clearer, and others less willing to extend any grace at all. Because this was not Tiger Woods' first encounter with public catastrophe. The events of 2009, the revelations about his personal life that dismantled the image he had spent decades constructing, had already put him through the kind of media fire that most people don't survive professionally. He had spent years after that trying to rebuild, surgery after surgery on a body that kept breaking, comeback attempt after comeback attempt on courses where he no longer felt like himself. A slow, painful public effort to find out who he was once the legend had been stripped away, and now this, again, in front of everyone, again. The commentary was fast, and often cruel in the way that commentary becomes when it doesn't pause to think. But in quieter rooms among people who had their own scars from public life, the conversation sounded different. According to people familiar with Vanessa's world at the time, she watched the coverage with something that wasn't judgment. It was closer to recognition. She had seen from very close range what it looked like when a person's worst moment became the only thing the world cared to remember about them. She understood the mechanics of it. She understood what it cost, and that understanding, those close to her say, is what finally broke through the wall she had so carefully maintained. When Vanessa spoke, it wasn't staged. It wasn't scripted. According to accounts from people within her circle at the time, her words came in a setting that was private and unguarded, the kind of space where people say what they actually believe instead of what they've prepared to say. And what she reportedly said was not what anyone anticipated. It wasn't inflammatory. It wasn't designed to generate attention. What it carried more than anything else was empathy. She reportedly spoke about recognizing something in what Tiger Woods was going through, not the specific details, not the legal circumstances, but the larger experience. The experience of having your lowest, most vulnerable, most human moment turned into entertainment for millions of people who have never met you and have no interest in understanding the full story. The experience of being reduced to a single moment when your life is made up of thousands of moments that no one ever sees. She was not, by any account, making excuses. She was not minimizing what had happened or the serious nature of the situation. But she was, apparently, refusing to join the chorus of people eager to tear someone down at their lowest point. And that refusal, small and quiet as it was, said something significant, because she had no obligation to say anything. She had every reason to stay silent, to stay neutral, to let the story belong entirely to someone else. The fact that she chose not to, that she allowed herself to be visible in that moment, to be human in a way that her life had rarely made easy, revealed something about her that the public version of her story had never quite captured. It also opened up questions that don't have clean answers, about what she had witnessed in her own life that made that kind of empathy come so naturally, about what it does to a person to watch someone else's pain from a distance and recognize in it something that echoes your own experience. About the invisible cost of being seen only in fragments, never as a whole. Those questions lingered. They still do. There is a quiet myth that lives inside the idea of chosen silence. The myth says that if you don't speak, you are at peace. That the wall you build keeps everything out, the noise, the pain, the weight of being perceived by strangers who will never understand you. That silence is its own kind of answer, clean and complete. The reality is almost always something more complicated than that. For Vanessa, years of deliberate quietness had not been years of ease. People who know her well have described a woman who felt things with real depth, who processed the public dimensions of her life with careful, sustained attention, who sometimes found the distance between who she actually was and who the world had decided she was almost impossible to navigate. She was not a simple person who happened to have a complicated last name. She was someone living inside genuine complexity every day, carrying it privately because the alternative, letting it show, came with consequences she wasn't willing to accept. When she spoke about Tiger Woods, reportedly with compassion, with recognition, with words that people in the room found quietly moving, it was not a break from who she was. It was, according to those who know her, completely consistent with the version of her that the public had never been allowed to see. And that is perhaps the most striking thing about all of it. Not what she said, not the name she said it about, but the reminder that the people we reduce to characters, to tabloid subjects, to punchlines, to cautionary tales, are almost always carrying something the camera cannot capture. Something heavy and private and deeply human that shapes how they see the world even when the world isn't watching. She had been carrying her version of that weight quietly for years. And in one small, unplanned moment, she let a little of it show. The people who witnessed it were, by most accounts, quietly surprised, not because the words were extraordinary, but because the willingness to be that genuinely human, in a life that rarely made it safe to be, felt extraordinary in itself. There is something inherently uncomfortable about placing these two people in the same story. Tiger Woods and Vanessa Trump come from entirely different worlds. Their paths through public life don't follow the same map. Their experiences of fame and failure and scrutiny are distinct in almost every measurable way. And yet there is a thread, thin, easy to miss, but real, that connects them if you're willing to look for it. Both of them have spent significant parts of their lives being defined by things that were not entirely within their control. By names, by associations, by moments that became bigger than the people they actually were. Tiger Woods built a legacy that is genuinely extraordinary, and for long stretches of his most public years, that legacy was almost beside the point in the conversation people were having about him. His personal life, his failures, his pain, these became global content, consumed by people who felt entitled to have opinions about a man they had never met and would never understand. He survived it slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly. He came back to the course, he came back to himself. Not the untouchable figure he had been, that version was gone, and perhaps that was its own kind of relief, but something more honest, something more human. A person trying to understand who he was once the mythology had been cleared away. Vanessa Trump moved through her own version of that clearing. She had entered one of the most consuming public dynasties in modern American history, and spent years learning to exist inside it without losing the parts of herself that mattered. When the marriage ended, she chose the harder, quieter path, the one that didn't offer the relief of public sympathy in exchange for private exposure. She built something real in the aftermath, carefully, away from the cameras, for herself and for her children. When she spoke about his arrest, without judgment, without distance, with something that felt like genuine human recognition, she was, perhaps without fully intending to, illuminating something true about both of them. That the public versions of people are almost never the whole picture. That the moments we consume as entertainment are, for the people actually living through them, simply life. Difficult, disorienting, and far more layered than any headline has room to hold. Questions remain, they probably always will. About the full context of what she said and what moved her to say it after so long. About whether it was a conscious choice or simply an unguarded moment. About what it meant to her, if it meant anything beyond the instinct of one person recognizing the humanity in another at a moment, when the rest of the world was looking the other way. No official conclusion has been reached, no neat ending exists. Just two very human people, living inside very public lives, and one small, unlikely moment where one of them chose something real over something safe. And the world, briefly, caught a glimpse of who she actually was. We live in a time that is extraordinarily skilled at building people up and extraordinarily efficient at tearing them back down. It moves fast. It moves loudly. And it almost never pauses long enough to consider what it's actually doing to the human beings caught at the center of it. The machinery doesn't care about accuracy. It cares about volume. And the people who get fed into it rarely come out on the other side exactly as they went in. Vanessa Trump's choice to speak, quietly, honestly, in a moment that was never designed to be public, is a small thing when you hold it up against the full architecture of these stories. It won't rewrite the headlines that already exist. It won't change any official record of anything that happened, but it does something else, something that matters in a quieter way. It adds texture to a narrative that the world had already flattened. It insists, gently but unmistakably, that the people inside these stories are more complicated than the stories themselves. It reminds anyone willing to listen that empathy, when it surfaces in places where it has every reason not to, is always worth paying attention to. Tiger Woods, in the years following his arrest, did not disappear. He confronted what had happened with a visibility that felt genuine rather than managed. He spoke about his struggles. He returned to golf not as the legend reborn, but as a person, imperfect, determined, willing to be seen in a way that the earlier, more protected version of himself never quite was. That shift, however it happened, was visible to anyone paying close attention. He became, in some ways, more worth watching after the mythology fell away. Vanessa Trump was doing something parallel in her own quieter register. Slowly, privately, deliberately, she was building something that belonged entirely to her. Not to the name, not to the family, not to the public appetite for her story. To her. The moment she spoke about Tiger Woods was not, when you look at it clearly, really about Tiger Woods at all. It was about recognition. It was about what happens when one person has lived close enough to a certain kind of pain that they can see it clearly in someone else, even across the distance of very different lives. It was about the choice to say something real when saying nothing would have been so much easier and so much safer. That kind of quiet honesty doesn't make the front page, it doesn't trend. It doesn't generate the kind of heat that the news cycle runs on, but it says something about a person that no headline ever could. And in a world that so rarely rewards that kind of honesty with anything other than more scrutiny, it is worth taking a moment, a real, unhurried moment, to simply notice it. If this story stayed with you, if something in it made you think about the space between who people really are and who the world decides they must be, share what you're feeling in the comments. These are the conversations that deserve more room than a headline can give them, and if you believe that every story is worth more than its surface, stay with us. We tell them that way every time.